He was the Imam everyone trusted. Nobody knew what he was doing after the mosque. Imam Jameel was not just a man of God. He was the man of God. The one you called when your marriage was falling apart. The one you ran to when your child stopped breathing in the night. The one who prayed over your business before you opened it. Who held your hand at your mother's graveside. Every Friday, before the sun climbed high, the mosque filled with men in clean white garments and women seated quietly behind the curtains. And when Imam Jameel stood to speak, the room settled. His voice was deep, steady, and certain. It didn't rush. It didn't shake. It carried conviction, the kind that made people believe everything would be all right. And at the front of that mosque, standing behind the carved wooden pulpit that his own hands had built, was Imam Adam. Imam Jameel was the kind of man a whole village leaned on without thinking twice. In Al-Jannah, his name carried weight. When people spoke of faith, they spoke of him. When problems rose, marriages breaking, sickness spreading, deaths tightening around throats, his door was the first they knocked on. He had built that mosque from almost nothing. 15 years earlier, he arrived with a one Quran and a faith that made people curious. Now, the mosque stood strong, surrounded by a school, a borehole, and a community that trusted him with their lives. At home, his wife Amina supported him quietly. She managed the house, welcomed visitors, and never complained about the long hours he spent serving others. To the outside world, they were a picture of stability. But something had started to shift. After Jama prayers, when the crowd thinned and the final greetings were exchanged, Imam Jameel would disappear. No one questioned it. A man like him deserved solitude, they said. But solitude was not where he was going. And whatever waited for him beyond the village path was not something the people of Al-Jannah were prepared to understand. The pond lay hidden beyond the last footpath of Al-Jannah, where the earth softened and the air grew cooler, as if the forest itself guarded a secret. Most villagers never went that far. They said the place felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Even birds seemed to avoid it. But Imam Jameel knew the path by heart. He had first found the pond years ago, long before the mosque was filled, before his name carried weight. Back then, he had been uncertain, burdened by questions he could not ask anyone. It was on one of those restless evenings that he wandered into the woods and heard something, a sound that was not quite a voice, yet unmistakably calling. That was when he saw her. Layla. She was already there, half submerged, her presence as natural as the reflection of the moon on the surface. Her hair moved with the water though there was no wind, and her eyes held something ancient, something that did not belong to time as humans understood it. Imam Jameel had not run. He should have, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer. You came, she had said, her voice soft but certain, as if she had expected him all along. From that night, the pond became a place he returned to not out of curiosity, but out of need. Layla did not behave like a woman of the world. She did not ask him about his status, his responsibilities, or the people who depended on him. She did not praise him or question him. She simply listened. And when she spoke, it was never to impress, never to instruct, but to reveal. You carry too many voices inside you, she once told him. None of them are your own. Those words stayed with him. After every Jumu'ah, when the mosque emptied and the last handshake was done, Imam Jameel would change into plain clothes and walk the quiet path to the pond. There, he would sit at the edge while Layla watched him with that same steady gaze. With her, he spoke freely about the pressure of being seen as perfect, about the exhaustion of always having answers, about the fear of failing people who believed he could never fall. Layla never judged him. But even in those quiet moments, something unsettled him. Because deep down, Imam Jameel knew this was not a place he was meant to belong. The peace he found there came with a silence that felt too complete, too detached from the world he had built. And yet, he kept coming back. Amina began to notice the changes long before she understood them. At first, it was small things. The way Imam Jameel no longer lingered after meals. The way his laughter, once easy and warm, now came late like something remembered rather than felt. He still spoke kindly, still fulfilled his duties as a husband, but something essential had shifted. It was as though part of him was always elsewhere, just out of reach. Their home, once filled with quiet companionship, had grown careful. Amina was not a woman who rushed to conclusions. She believed in patience, in prayer, in giving space for burdens she could not yet see. But she also believed in observation. And what she observed did not settle her heart. He had begun to leave immediately after Jumu'ah. Not occasionally. Not when called upon. Every single Friday. He would return hours later with the same calm expression, the same measured tone, offering simple explanations that never quite answered anything. I had somewhere to be, he would say. Or, there are matters I must handle quietly. Quietly. That word began to trouble her. One evening, as she folded his clothes, she paused. There was a faint scent on his garments, not perfume, not anything she could name. Just different. Not of the home. Not of the mosque. Something unfamiliar, like water after rain, but deeper, older. She sat with that thought longer than she intended. Amina had stood beside this man from the beginning. She had seen him when he had nothing, when his faith was the only thing he possessed in abundance. She knew his strength. She also knew his weaknesses, or at least, she thought she did. Now, she wasn't so sure. Their daughter, Zainab, had started asking questions too. Why does Baba always go out after mosque? She asked one afternoon, her voice soft, curious but not careless. Amina smiled, the way mothers do when they are buying time. He has responsibilities, she replied gently. Zainab nodded, but her eyes lingered. Children noticed more than adults allowed. That night, Amina lay awake longer than usual. Beside her, Imam Jameel slept with the stillness of a man who had trained himself to be unreadable, even in rest. She turned slightly, studying his face in the dim light. There was no visible guilt there. No restlessness. Just calm. And somehow, that unsettled her more than anything else. Because Amina had begun to understand something she could not yet fully say. It was not just that her husband was keeping a secret. It was that he had learned how to live inside it, completely. Amina did not plan to follow him. It was a decision that formed quietly, the way storms gather without warning. That evening, when Imam Jameel slipped out after Isha, she wrapped her scarf tightly and stepped into the night a few moments later, keeping her distance. The path to the woods was darker than she expected. Every sound felt louder, the crack of twigs, the whisper of wind. Her heart beat fast, not from fear of the forest, but from fear of what she might find. When she reached the pond, she stopped. Jameel stood at the water's edge. And then the water moved. A figure rose slowly, shimmering under the moonlight. Long hair. Pale skin. A tail that caught the light like glass. The mermaid. Amina's breath caught in her throat. She watched as they spoke, close, familiar. Not strangers. Not something new. Something known. Something repeated. In that moment, the truth did not come like a shock. It settled heavily, like something her heart had already suspected. The man she trusted with her life had a world she was never meant to enter. Amina did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly, replaying what she had seen by the pond. By dawn, her heart was no longer confused, only heavy and clear. When Imam Jameel returned from the mosque that evening, she did not serve him food. She did not ask about his day. She stood in the doorway and said quietly, "I followed you." The room went still. "I saw the pond," she continued. "And I saw her." For the first time in many years, Imam Jameel had no words ready. The man who could guide a crowd of hundreds stood silent before one woman. "It is not what you think," he finally said, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. "Then tell me what it is," Amina replied, her voice steady but breaking underneath. And so he told her. Not everything, not neatly but enough. About the years, the meetings, the peace he found there. Amina listened, her eyes fixed on him. "When did I stop being enough for you?" she asked softly. He had no answer. And in that silence, something between them shifted quietly, permanently. The change did not arrive like thunder. It came quietly, the way harmattan dust settles, fine, persistent, impossible to ignore once it has touched everything. At first, it was small things. Imam Jameel ended his sermons earlier than usual. His words, once full and commanding, now felt measured, almost cautious. He paused more. He looked past people instead of into them. Those who knew his rhythm could feel it immediately, even if they could not explain it. Then came the absences. After Jumu'ah, when people expected him to linger, to greet, to pray over children and counsel troubled hearts, he began to leave quickly. No long conversations. No lingering smiles. Just a quiet exit. People noticed. In the market, whispers began to move between stalls. "Have you seen him lately? He looks different. Burdened." No one said anything openly. Not yet. A man like Imam Jameel was not easily questioned. He was a symbol, and symbols are protected long after cracks begin to show. But symbols do not silence truth forever. And in Al-Jannah, something unspoken had begun to grow, a quiet awareness that the man they trusted completely was slowly becoming someone they did not fully recognize. The night after the whispers reached their loudest point, Imam Jameel did not go to the pond. For the first time in years, he stayed inside his home, sitting alone on the thin prayer mat in the corner of his room. The house was quiet. Amina had taken their daughter to her sister's place. The silence pressed against him, heavier than any sermon he had ever delivered. He stared at his hands. These were the same hands people trusted, hands that had prayed over the sick, blessed marriages, buried the dead. Yet they were also the hands that had hidden a life no one knew. Before dawn, he stood, made ablution, and began to pray. Not the composed, measured prayers people saw in the mosque, but broken ones. Unsteady. Honest. "I have divided myself," he whispered. "And I cannot carry both." When the sun rose, Imam Jameel made his decision. He would not return to the pond. Not because Layla had no meaning, but because the truth demanded a cost. And for the first time, he was ready to pay it. The fall of Imam Jameel did not happen with thunder. It happened quietly, like something fragile finally giving way. The mosque did not collapse. The walls still stood. The call to prayer still echoed. But something inside the people shifted. The certainty they once held about one man began to dissolve, replaced by a harder, more honest understanding. For weeks, the elders led the prayers. There was no single voice at the front. No one tried to replace what had been lost too quickly. Instead, they sat with it, the discomfort, the questions, the truth they had ignored. Amina stopped attending for a while. Not out of anger, but because she needed silence more than sermons. When she returned, she did not sit in her old place. She sat in the middle. People began to speak differently. Women spoke more. Quiet things were no longer ignored. And somewhere in the distance, the pond remained still. Untouched. Unspoken. But no longer innocent. The village had learned something it could not unlearn, that a man could lead prayers and still be lost, and that sometimes, what destroys a community is not sin but silence. There was no dramatic turning point after everything fell apart. No single moment where the sky opened and declared that healing had begun. What came instead was something slower, quieter, and far more difficult to measure. Imam Jameel did not return to the pulpit. He stopped going to the pond. That, more than anything else, was the choice that marked the beginning of whatever came next. The first Friday he stayed back in the village after Jumu'ah, he sat at the far end of the mosque, not in front, not even in the second row. People noticed, but no one spoke to him. Not out of hatred, but out of uncertainty. They did not know what to do with a man who had once stood above them and now sat among them, smaller somehow, quieter. Amina did not ask him if he still thought about Layla. She already knew the answer. Instead, she watched what he did. He walked before far and swept the mosque courtyard without being asked. He repaired broken benches. He visited the sick again, but this time without the authority of a title, only as a man carrying food, sitting quietly, listening more than he spoke. There was no performance in it. That was the difference. The village began to adjust, not quickly, not easily, but steadily. A new imam led the prayers. The mosque continued. Children still ran across the courtyard after lessons. Life, as it always does, refused to stop for one man's fall. One evening, as the call to Maghrib softened into the dusk, Jameel stood at the edge of the woods. He did not step forward. He did not call her name. He simply stood there for a long time, then turned back toward the village. And in that turning, something settled, not fully healed, not forgiven entirely, but grounded. Because redemption, he was beginning to understand, was not found in what was hidden. It was built, slowly, in what was done when everyone was watching and when no one was. The question was, would he be forgiven for seeking wisdom from a world so far removed from the human understanding of the divine?